thank you everybody for coming tonight to this talk. And thank you very much to the Exchange for organising such a topical event. We do have a microphone, but because we're all academics, we should be used to hollering, yeah? And microphones can be more trouble than they're worth sometimes. So if you can't hear at the back or even at the front, just let us know and we can revert to using the microphone. Okay? Great. So, as Will said, we're going to ask each speaker to talk for about 10 minutes on this topic of the panel event tonight, Ukraine, a nation in crisis, and then we'll have lots of time for questions afterwards. We do need to finish by 8 o'clock. If you need to go, then please do so. So, to kick us off, I'd like to ask Dr. Victoria Hudson to speak. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. It's a pleasure to be among such an illustrious company, and also to hopefully engage in a really interesting interactive discussion with yourselves as well. I think it's actually quite difficult to talk about Ukraine and the crisis that's erupted there in recent months for several reasons. Firstly, so much has already been said about it. The press is full of coverage. But not only for that reason, the situation is so fluid. Days have been that I've gone to class and talked about the subject and come back from class and it's been irrelevant what I've said. And also because the situation is so fluid, things are developing very quickly. And also the situation is very polarised. It's easy, I think, to slip on one hand into platitudes, on the other hand into controversy. So I shall try to avoid both of those things, but we'll see. So in terms of contributing, I thought maybe it would be interesting to talk about a little bit about the domestic context in Ukraine, which is informing the foreign policy approach of the country. Because Ukraine is very often characterised as being split into the east and the west of the country, kind of dichotomies. The west, on one hand, is seen to be very pro-European, the Ukrainophone, the heartland of Ukrainian nationalism. On the other hand, we have eastern Ukraine, which is seen to be very, not only Russophone, also pro-Russian in its outlook, and rather Sovietized, so sort of bearing the full brunt of the legacies of the Soviet Union in a rather reconstructed way. And this isn't without foundation, I should add. There are good reasons for thinking this. It's rooted, in fact, to some degree, but also the cleavages are much less pillarised, more cross-cutting than is sometimes given credit, especially among the younger generation, the people who have grown up in independent Ukraine, who, it seems to me, have very different and developing views on the situation and the role of Ukraine in the world, and indeed the future leaders of the country. But of course, at the same time, no country is without its history and without its past. So I'd like to maybe comment on three different dimensions of attitudes, three attitudinal cleavages in Ukraine that I noticed when I was doing my fieldwork there in 2011. These are, the first is there's cultural differences, attitudes towards foreign policy, and also value differences. Firstly, as to cultural questions, indeed, if we look at the culture and attitudes towards Russian culture, I think we can see quite a clear difference between the east and the west of the country. In the west, people do indeed look much more to Europe for their reference point, for their outlook. There is much more integration in Central Europe as a cultural space, as an economic space, whereas to the east, people naturally, perhaps, given the geographical position, tend to adopt rather more, it seems to me, even among the young people, viewpoints that reflect quite closely those of Russians across the border. For instance, the views of Russia as a great power, as a great civilization, these sort of views are much more prevalent in eastern Ukraine, whereas in western Ukraine there's a lot more skepticism towards Russia as a great power, as a great culture. Looking at foreign policy attitudes, the cleavage is similarly polarised, if not more so, because on the cultural level, there is some appreciation in Western Ukraine for Russia's cultural achievements, whereas on a political level, there is a rather strongly critical attitude towards Russian foreign policy towards Ukraine and in terms of its view in the world. In the West, the understanding of Russian foreign policy, I would say, tends to reflect more closely that what we would know here in Britain, in the West, in terms of criticising imperialism. Russian foreign policy very much framed, even before recent events, in terms of an imperial threat to Ukrainian national sovereignty, not just territorial sovereignty, but economic sovereignty and indeed cultural sovereignty. Whereas in the east of Ukraine, there's a sense of, well, we're two separate states. None of the young people, I spoke mostly to young people when I was there, people in their 20s. There's a sense of, well, Ukraine and Russia are two separate states. Maybe in the older generation, there is still a sense of common land, common homeland. But in the east, among the young people, it's accepted that we're two separate states, but the border is still rather fluid, and a more sympathetic view towards Russian foreign policy positions. And this reflects, I would say, in both cases, the different media that are prevalent in both different zones. In the Western Ukraine, the media, there's much more reception of Russian media channels, or not just Russian channels, but Ukrainian-owned channels such as Inter, that very much are quite close to following a Russian line. Not uncritically, but generally they're quite compatible. Whereas in the West, we've seen channels such as Channel 5, 1+1, which are owned, perhaps not coincidentally, by the people that have been advancing the opposition. So Petro Poroshenko, Igor Kolomoisky, people who are close to them are now in the administration, the interim administration in Kiev, whereas conversely, the Party of Regions, the Party of Viktor Yanukovych, has no representatives in the interim government. Presumably, that will change when the presidential elections, the legislative elections come, but that's how the situation is now. So, to sum up, looking at cultural aspects and foreign policy aspects, there is, I would say, quite a cleavage in terms of this traditional East-West line. But when I was in Ukraine, I also asked about people's values, so a more social question, cultural, political, in a more general sense. In order to evaluate what people thought about value issues, I looked very much to the speeches, the texts, the opinions of the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. So it's Patriarch Kirill, he's the head of the Moscow Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, and there is this is the body that is leading the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. There are a number of different churches in Ukraine, it should be said, several of which are Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox in terms of their denomination, but look to different places for leadership. So the Moscow Patriarchate, as the name indicates, looks to Moscow, but there's also the Kiev Patriarchate, which is considered as schismatic, non-canonical, because it declared independence from the Russian Church in the wake of independence. One must also talk about the Greek Catholic Church, which is the main church in the west of Ukraine. It looks to Rome for leadership, but actually follows Orthodox rites. And one can also talk about the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church. That's a much smaller church. The main church is the Moscow Patriarchate, in fact. But given the legacy of Sovietization, most of its parishes are actually in the west of Ukraine, which is rather interesting. And many people do not even know whether they attend the Moscow or the Kiev Patriarchate for their religious practices. So, relatively, Ukraine is quite a religious country, both in terms of religious practice and in terms of the infiltration of cultural, spiritual values into the wider Ukrainian culture. They're represented in the media. And when I did some field work, both qualitative and quantitative in Ukraine, I found that in comparison to the cultural and political, strictly cultural, strictly political issues, which were rather polarised, actually the differences on this value level by issues that are inspired by not just religion but sort of a social conservatism, let's say, were rather not statistically significant across the country, both in the West, in the capital city, in the East. People were very much sharing these common, let's say, as Patriarch Kirill would, civilisational values that connect Ukraine to Holy Russia. What does this mean for our foreign policy outlook? Well, people for economic issues were very much looking to the EU. Even in the East, people said, well, the future is not with Russia, but for economic reasons it's much more lucrative for us to look to Europe. But at the same time, they did not subscribe to the views that were being, they felt, promulgated by the European Union in Ukraine, and there was a desire to have the economic benefits but resist the cultural dimension. What does this mean for foreign policy? Well, to sum up, possibly that now, in the past, Ukraine has tried to follow a multi-vectoral foreign policy, both looking to the west and to the east, to get the best of both worlds. It seems rational, right? But both sides have tried to make them choose. I think possibly now there will be a move towards the west, but there's an underlying cultural potential that, given the shared social conservatism, which is closer to Russia, could create some problems in that regard. So they'll have to play this quite carefully, I think, if they want to get the population on side, if they are going to pursue a closer path with Europe.
Thank you very much. Perfect time as well. Thank you also for that. Wonderful. Okay, we're going to pass now to Dr. Adam Swain.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. In these opening remarks, I would like to make kind of 4 points. One is on the causes of the revolution in Kiev. One about the geopolitical implications of that revolution. Another about the economic crisis that the country faces. And then finally, a point about the future of the country itself. So firstly then, it is well known that the revolution, the uprising, the coup, depending on what we want to call it, was the result of millions of people, particularly in the West, particularly in the centre of the country, and most especially in Kiev, being dissatisfied with the situation of their lives. Low incomes, whether that be wages, whether that be benefits and pensions, high inequality when you see a few rich tycoons, so-called oligarchs, billionaires parading their wealth. Also people being forced to engage in shadow financial transactions in order to survive. We're very familiar with the idea of envelope wages. And of course people were forced into having to pay unofficially for vital public services such as much needed health and education services. It really was a revolution against the deprivations of the present. However, less well understood is the way the revolution was also involved the rejection of an invented nightmare, a spectre which haunted the future. It was a nightmare vision of the future that gripped a large proportion of the population and became a script for action. I will give an example of what I mean. At an academic conference in Glasgow, where we were just talking about a few moments ago, last May I listened to an eminent Ukrainian professor from the Kiev Mohyla Academy, a political scientist, if I recall correctly, who speculated about the possibility that Russia could invade Ukraine. I was genuinely puzzled that anyone could think such a thing. To me, this prospect seemed unthinkable. However, 10 months later, Russian troops appeared to control Crimea, and there are warnings of an invasion in the east. How did this come to pass? At that conference in Glasgow, I came to realise that a nightmare scenario or script had taken hold. This invented script went something like this. President Yanukovych was authoritarian and even possibly a dictator. But as we now know, after the the loss of Crimea and the collapse of his regime, in fact the state was very weak. It wasn't really authoritarian in the conventional sense of the term. And Yanukovych was a pretty lousy dictator. Also, a part of this nightmare was that Viktor Yanukovych would not voluntarily give up power. But as we know, a presidential election was scheduled for February 2015, when he would probably have lost. And then during the current political crisis, the nightmare expanded to include that Ukraine would join the Russian-led customs union, even though the government kept saying that it had no intention of such a course of action. And that Independence Square, Maidan, would be violently crushed, even though much of the evidence suggested that the government had tried to avoid appearing authoritarian, at least for most of the time. And then we have the prospect, which the professor raised in Glasgow, of Russian tanks rolling into Kiev to prop up the despised government. I would argue this invented nightmare vision of the future bore little relation to reality, but sufficient number of people believed the nightmare and came to the conclusion that they had no choice but to fight the government and the president, and even to lay down their lives. The problem I'm trying to draw your attention to is that the anti-government movement was legitimated by the reaction it provoked. The protesters imagined that Maidan would be violently crushed, and so they attacked the parliament, which was defended by riot police, who then shot back. In other words, the invented nightmare was taken as a script for action, which helped to realise that very nightmare. This brings me to my second brief point, which is that if the democratically elected president of Ukraine had not been overthrown, Crimea would not have been invaded, and Ukraine would still be unified today. Once again, the overthrow of Yanukovych is legitimised by the reaction it provoked, namely the annexation of Crimea by Russia. But my wider point is that Ukraine is a battlefield where the West and Russia contest with one another, and we've had a flavour of that already. When the broadly pro-Russian Yanukovych was in power, the West sought to destabilise the country by undermining the legitimacy of political and commercial elites. Now that a pro-Western government is in Kiev, it is the turn of Russia to destabilise the country, and it has done so by annexing Crimea and by amassing military forces on Ukraine's eastern frontier. In this respect, last Friday was a defining day in Ukrainian history. On the one hand, the 28-member EU signed a mostly symbolic association agreement with the new government, which envisages aligning foreign and security policy, whilst Putin signed into law the formal annexation of Crimea. What these treaties mean is that Russia's annexation of Crimea is only a consolation prize, a rearguard action, because it is the West which has won the battle for control in Kiev and in the remainder of Ukraine. Thirdly, one often overlooked element of the crisis is the state of the country's economy. Even prior to the political crisis, the economy was in recession, which began in the second half of 2012. It should also be remembered that Ukraine was one of the economies worst affected by the global financial crisis. GDP fell by between 15 and 16% in 2009. Last year, the current account deficit was 9%, and the consolidated fiscal deficit, including accrued arrears for Russian gas, was over 9% of GDP as well. The tapering of unconventional monetary policy by the US and other Western governments has made it more difficult to fund the deficit and to fund debt repayments in the capital markets. Bond yields have increased to as high as 14%. Even before the political crisis began, non-performing loans amounted to around 40% of all loans, and several West European banks have divested from the Ukrainian market. And of course the situation has got worse in the last few months. During the crisis, bank deposits have fallen by more than 5%, risking a bank liquidity crisis. The government has run out of money, and currency reserves have fallen to perhaps $12 billion, less than 2 months of imports. Also in early February, the central bank abandoned the peg of the hryvnia to the dollar, and the currency devalued by almost 10%. To control the dollarization of the economy, the National Bank introduced capital controls, but as half the economy is in the informal sector, these will have a marginal and a market-distorting effect. Also during the crisis, economic activity has been curtailed. Industrial production in January 2014 was 5% lower than the January 2013. Moreover, tax revenues have also declined. Moreover, the change of government in Kiev means it has lost access to discounted Russian gas, and the 15 billion bond buying scheme agreed with Russia on the 17th of December last year. And political instability will persist until some time after the presidential election is held on the 25th of May. And even after, if political stability does appear in Ukraine, then any agreement, likely agreement with the IMF, is likely to disappoint Maidan protesters and lead to widespread hardship and dissatisfaction with the new government. It's predicted that GDP will decline by anything up to 10% in 2014 and may not begin to recover until the beginning of 2016. Finally, I would like to say a few words about the future composition of the country, which I think will involve some form of federalism. And indeed, this is going to be important to keep the country together. The future of Ukraine depends on what happens in the populous, the urban, and the industrial east of Ukraine, and particularly in cities like Donetsk, which certainly what used to be twinned with Sheffield and may still be. The fall of Yanukovych, whose power base was in Donetsk, and the disorientation of his party, the Party of the Regions, left a vacuum in that important region. Into that vacuum, a self-styled so-called people's governor appeared, called Pavel Gubarev, as the leader of an organisation called the Patriotic Forces of the Donbass. This organisation's manifesto includes refusal to accept the new government as legitimate. They believe it came to power in a coup. They demand a referendum on the federalisation of Ukraine. They demand local decision-making in the field of economic policy, welfare and prices, making Russia a strategic partner of the region, and of making the Russian language a state language in Donetsk Oblast. And they also want the local control of police and other security agencies. Now, although the movement in Donetsk could only muster crowds measured in the single thousands, it was nevertheless able to influence the region's political and economic elite. After all, an opinion poll conducted during the political crisis, but before the fall of Yanukovych, suggested that 33% of the population of Donetsk preferred unity with Russia. So first, reflecting that popular will, first the city council and then the regional council supported in principle the holding of a referendum on the status of Donetsk in Ukraine. However, once the acting president, Alexander Turchinov, appointed a new governor, a local business tycoon, so-called oligarch Sergei Taruta, the executive authority in the region exerted its power and arrested the people's governor, and he currently languishes in jail as we speak this evening. But demands for regional autonomy will not dissipate. Last Thursday, the Regional Council discussed a draft appeal to the Parliament in Kiev, and there was a whole series of elements to this appeal, but I'll just refer to the most important, and that is they're demanding a new constitution. A new constitution which decentralises power to regional and local governments, which involves establishing executive bodies accountable to those local councils and regional councils, and the establishment of a bicameral parliament in Kiev with an upper chamber representing the regions. Now, whilst deputies in the council are no doubt trying to destabilise the region to ensure they remained indispensable not only to the local population but also to the new authorities in Kiev, some form of decentralisation, federalisation, regional autonomy, it's yet to be determined, will be needed, I argue, if the country is not to lose any more regions as it has with Crimea. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know how many of you are Telegraph readers, but some of you may have noticed online yesterday that in an opinion poll in Donetsk, 61% voted for becoming part of the UK. Now, I'm quite sure this is because Donetsk is twinned with Sheffield, and they probably think, but it does touch on what Victoria said, that sometimes, you know, if you ask the population of the Ukraine what they think, then you can come up with some rather strange ideas. Mention of Donetsk means that I do have to declare an interest. My son has married a Russian from Donetsk. She came over to study at Wigan when she was 16, and 20 years later she's decided not to go home and has been here ever since. I myself had 3 years in the old Soviet Union, married a Soviet citizen. So, you know, my son is half Russian. So I have to declare an interest that I have a great respect and love for the Russian people, which by no means always and by no means often stretches out to the Russian authorities or indeed the Soviet authorities. But it does mean that, you know, I looked at, for example, the Sochi Games with almost totally different eyes from a lot of people, a lot of my neighbours. It was nice to see the young Russians, the young volunteers in particular, which had been so successful in the 2012 Olympics in London, giving a sort of outgoing, cheerful, hospitable, non-xenophobic, certainly, attitude. And unfortunately, I wrote an article for a Russian website expressing how glad I was to see this. I wrote it on the 25th, on the closing day of the Olympic Games, and they published it on the 3rd of March, which by that time Ukraine had blown up in our faces. So what I thought I'd do, because none of us sort of had met to exchange what we were going to talk about before, I thought that I'd talk about one area in which I've had some expertise, which is the linguistic side, you know, not just the language problems, but something I would call the cultural narrative. And again, Victoria and Adam have both alluded to the fact that there is a split. I don't want to call it a civilisational split, it sounds a bit too much like Samuel Huntington, but more like a tradition split. Those of you who are au fait with the situation in Northern Ireland, or indeed the Serbian-Croatian split, some might say the Israeli-Palestinian split, will know that in such situations it's the extreme view that tends to come to the fore, and the moderate voices, who actually represent probably the best outcome for both sides, tend to be drowned. So basically, if I had to give a name to the sort of 10-minute contribution, I'd say 2 wrongs do not make a right. I think the West has been very deficient in understanding both Russia and Ukraine. And this is not accidental, because, again, you know, I come from, you know, I did my PhD at the university that both Derek and Victoria represent now. And, you know, in those days there was an absolute wealth of knowledge about the Soviet Union. Just at one university alone, Birmingham, there were 45 people doing PhDs and other research on the Soviet Union. All that pretty much came to a shuddering halt in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, not just in Britain. And Russian departments, you're very lucky at Sheffield, you've still got one. I'm a bit unlucky in Bradford, we lost ours. But also in the United States. I have many, many friends who are Russian linguists, Americans, who were told re-qualify in 3 months as an Arab specialist or quit. And if you think of the impact that would have, then you can see that you know, there are going to be problems there. So I don't just want to talk about the 2 mutually exclusive narratives. One of them obviously between the Western Central Ukrainians and the pro-Russian Ukrainians. I mean, clearly there are 2 narratives there, but also there's a conflicting and almost mutually exclusive narrative between the West and Russia. And when I say the West, it's most particularly the United States, but you know, the UK isn't far behind. And the interesting thing I would say, and perhaps I am looking this through rose-tinted spectacles, is that the government level attitude to Russia is not reflected in popular opinion at all. You know, I think, you know, the Russians are much more liked amongst the British public than they are by the Foreign Office, for example. You know, it's, I don't have figures to prove that, but it's just my empirical experience over the years. So, what is it? Why is the United States so Russophobic? A lot of it, I think, stems obviously from the Cold War, the the genuine fear of communism, and the attempts after the collapse of the Soviet Union to make sure that communism never reared its head in Russia again. If you recall, in both Poland and Lithuania, reformed communist parties won free and fair elections in elections subsequent to the collapse of the Berlin Wall. In 1996, that should have happened in Russia too. You know, they won the Duma elections, but the Duma elections didn't count for much because there was Yeltsin instituted a very strong presidential rule. In 1996, there was not a free and fair election, but Yeltsin was re-elected. Despite having lost, despite losing, and subsequently he did lose the war, the first war in Chechnya, he was given an enormous help by those of the oligarchs that supported him to actually ensure that the communists and the so-called liberal Democrats, the almost fascist party in Russia, didn't come to power. That probably might have had a good cleansing effect had that occurred, because the next time round they would have been voted out. I think the fear, as they were incidentally in both Poland and Lithuania, because they never quite had that opportunity, the strength of those forces in the Russian political spectrum are actually much stronger still than they should be. In fact, reading, I mean, again, I've been reading from the Russian websites to pick up exactly what they feel about the situation. And I'm reminded of when I was a student, and there were a lot of US coups effected in Latin America. And one of the Latin American jokes was, why will there never be a coup in the United States? Because there is no US embassy in Washington. You know, and there are other institutions, of course. And this seems to be the sort of the narrative that's coming from Moscow and those that support them in the Ukraine. That there was a coup engineered by the American embassy in Kiev, and this was really what caused the crisis in the first place. And to kind of help lubricate that idea, of course, there have been 3 famous leaked telephone calls, all involving one man and one woman, all of them coming from the FSBs, all of them coming from the Russian security forces. The first, of course, Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, with her famous "fuck the EU," and you know, let's get rid of Klitschko and let's put Yatsenyuk into power, which she never denied and has never really, it's never really been you know, a major subject of discussion, certainly in the West. And then, of course, you've got the Aston discussion with the Estonian foreign minister, where he claimed that he had been told that it was the rebel forces in Maidan that had hired professional sharpshooters to actually kill both demonstrators and police on that day. Again, huge story for one day, and then it disappeared. And finally, yesterday, Yulia Tymoshenko, they released a telephone conversation with another member of the Ukrainian parliament, in which she threatened to nuke the Russians and used this wonderful phrase of, you know, let's kill the Katsa, which is the Russian word for, sorry, it's the Ukrainian jargon, if you like, for the Russians. It comes from goat, it means the goats, because the Russians all had ears like billy goats originally. You know, I mean, if you listen to the, she's denied it, of course, and said that it's been edited, etc. But actually, if you listen to all those 3 phone calls, all of them are on YouTube, then you do get the impression that, you know, there's some very, very hard ideas floating around from the West. So, basically, I would say the cultural narrative in the Ukraine really rests upon the way that it's perceived that the Soviet Union treated the two traditions. One of the things you may have picked up on in Putin's speech the other day was that he criticized the Western and Central Ukrainians' cult of Stepan Bandera. Now, Stepan Bandera was a Ukrainian nationalist who decided that in the wake of Stalin's Holodomor, the starvation of up to 7, some say 10 million Ukrainians in the 1930s, any regime would be better than Stalin's Soviet Union, including Hitler's Nazis. To this day, in Russian circles, both in Russia and Ukraine, he is a Nazi. To the Western Ukrainians in particular, he's a national hero. Actually, under Yushchenko, they brought out a stamp and put up a monument to him. So, the best way perhaps I can describe it is the most hated person in Western and Central Ukraine, the most hated Russian or Soviet leader is Stalin, because of what he did in the 1930s against the Kulaks and the Cossacks. The most hated Russian leader in the pro-Russian areas in the East is Mikhail Gorbachev, who as far as I know didn't kill anybody. But the reason, because he actually was to blame for the collapse of the Soviet Union. So to the Western mind, clearly, a choice between Joseph Stalin and Mikhail Gorbachev is a no-brainer. Of course, the West and the centre of Ukraine is on the side of right. But if you look at it from the Russian point of view, you know, I think Stalin still comes regularly second after Putin as the best leader they ever had. And when I was living over there, they used to say, well, when he took over in 1924, we were sort of 26th power in the world. When he died in 1953, we were the second most power and catching up with the first. What's not to like? You know, and again, it's very, very hard to argue with that, with that approach.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, Derek, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think this seems to have worked out pretty well. I mean, the other three speakers have illuminated certain, specific aspects of the Ukraine crisis, and there's very little overlap with what I want to talk about, which is the broader contours, if you like, of Russian foreign policy over about the last 15 years, from 1999. Well, I'll explain why 1999 in a minute, and the developments which have shaped the evolution of Russian views. I think all of which have implications for the Ukraine crisis. This is very complex. I've only got 10 minutes to cover it all. I noticed Vicky has a little box of tricks where she pressed a button and it counted down from 10 minutes. I don't own a mobile phone. I haven't got an iPod. I don't even know what an iPad is. FaceTube for me is the work of the devil, and anybody who twitters should leave themselves, as far as I'm concerned, open to extrajudicial execution. So, Paul, cut me off after 10 minutes. Feel free to do so.
That's all right. I won't tweet you then.
I don't want to make this an academic seminar, but equally I don't want to underestimate the knowledge and intelligence of the audience. So some of the things I say might be a bit unfamiliar, but we can always deal with those, I think, in questions and answers. So 5 main points. First of all, why 1999? Yesterday, 15 years ago, was the event which was the biggest shock for Russia's political class in the post-Soviet era. Anybody any idea what it was? We've forgotten 15 years later. It was the intervention in the former Republic of Yugoslavia by NATO over Kosovo. NATO did this out of area. In other words, this wasn't within the remit of NATO's traditional area, without a mandate from the UN Security Council. Moscow, and it wasn't alone, not even among Western European states, contested NATO's intervention, and a few years after that, in February 2008, Kosovo's subsequent declaration of independence. And the West has condemned, in turn, a few months after that, in August 2008, was Russia's intervention in South Ossetia, when Georgia launched an attack. And the West, in turn, condemned Russia's invasion of Georgia, which, in effect, I did quite a bit of work on this 2 or 3 years ago. It seemed to me was pretty much payback for Kosovo. As I say, Kosovo declared its independence in February 2008, although obviously different set of circumstances. But in August 2008, South Ossetia was invaded by Russia. Second point is the enlargement of NATO. Here I've got to say, I mean, I think probably the stuff you've been reading in the newspapers recently indicates a kind of really, hostile confrontation. Neither NATO nor Russia really sees each other, or has seen each other, as an immediate threat, which is likely to lead to the use of military force. And Moscow's had quite a lot to do with NATO on kind of lower level security policy issues. But the growing perception since the Kosovo crisis has been that the US-led NATO dominates Euro-Atlantic security and wants to project its power further east, while Russia is effectively marginalised in terms of decision-making in the Euro-Atlantic area. And this has been compounded by failure in arms control treaties, by no means all Russia's fault. It was the US that abrogated the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2001, and we have the looming problem now of NATO's deployment of NATO's ballistic missile defence in Europe. But these failures of arms control treaties tend to kind of lock in the structural confrontation of the Cold War period. And despite NATO's other functions, over the years it's evolved into, an organisation which provides a political toolbox for crisis management, and as a focal point for cooperative security partnerships. That's going to be a key thing at the upcoming NATO summit later on this year. Despite this, Moscow remains convinced that defence and deterrence remain NATO's pivotal tasks. Again, not without justification. I can talk about this a bit more in questions and answers. And that NATO is motivated by a desire to contain and marginalise Russia. So this kind of mutual misperceptions, which I think John talked about, and unfulfilled expectations of a genuine partnership is in danger of transforming, the entire kind of relationship. Third, the question of interventions. The US-led invasion of Iraq, shameful episode in which our beloved country participated. I can't wait for the publication of the Chilcot report. That'll be really interesting. Again, it took place without a clear mandate from the UN Security Council for the use of force. And then a few years later, 3 years ago, NATO's operation in Libya, which although there was a UN Security Council resolution, Russia didn't veto it, it abstained. This resolution authorised member states to take all necessary measures to protect the civilian population. But NATO's airstrikes against Gaddafi's forces eventually led to his overthrow, so again regime change. And Moscow's position, as I think was neatly put by Lavrov at the time, Foreign Minister Lavrov, was that the US and NATO must not act as a global surgeon prescribing radical intervention in complex internal conflicts and effect regime change. And this in turn over the last couple of years has led to Moscow's intransigent position over Syria, which, the conflict there still rages on despite the face-saving US-Russia sponsored agreement to destroy Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles. The fourth point is competition with the enlarged EU over influence in the states of the shared neighbourhood. Adam said something about that. I'm not going to go into it in any more detail than that. Moscow has seen the colour revolutions, the so-called colour revolutions, so the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, not only as moving these countries closer to Europe, at least in the case of Ukraine and Georgia, but also threatening order and stability in the post-Soviet space. And order and stability are sine qua non, they are absolutes as far as Russia is concerned. And it doesn't now want a repeat in Ukraine of what happened 10 years ago. And it'll do its best to avoid that. Fifth and finally, the liberal democracies, the Western liberal democracies' attacks on the legitimacy of Putin's authoritarian system. The West constantly criticises Moscow's commitment to democracy and human rights. Initially, this was over the wars in Chechnya, which were pretty horrible affairs, it has to be said, but more recently over the lack of political pluralism and media freedom in Russia, and Russia's support for the undemocratic regimes in the shared neighbourhood. Obviously, Yanukovych as being a case in point. In turn, Moscow accuses the West of double standards. Many examples of this. One glaring example was, as I've already mentioned, the West's support for the Saakashvili regime in Georgia, which launched the attack on South Ossetia in August 2008. Anyway, all of this has contributed to a shift in Russia's foreign policy over the last 10 to 15 years. At this point, again, I need to emphasise something, that Moscow has often, it seems to me, been constructive in its dealings with the West. It recognises the interdependence in terms both of trade and security, which are a key feature in today's global environment. But Moscow has increasingly begun over the last few years to criticise the norms and values of the West, or the Western Europe, if you like, and its approaches to Russia. Putin has said pretty openly in his speeches that what he called the 500-year period of dominance of the West is coming to an end, and he argued the need for a more democratic international system. In other words, the rising powers, the emerging powers, having more of a say in international affairs. In contrast to the narratives which were current in the 1990s, particularly the early 1990s, the Russian idea now is that integration with Greater Europe doesn't mean merging into Greater Europe. Russia sees itself as an opponent of the West in global development, but within the single framework of a single civilisational paradigm, the Greater Europe. I think I probably differ a little bit from one or two things that were said here there. And so the distinction is made by Russia's political class, and it isn't just Putin and his cronies. This is Russia's political class. There are very few liberals left in Russia's political class nowadays. So the distinction is made between a single civilisational Europe and a political Europe dominated by the Western liberal democracies. And this inevitably reinforces divisions in identity, which has the knock-on effect of differences in political approaches, which again I think John referred to. Okay, to turn now to Moscow's intervention in Ukraine. I've already spoken about Moscow's traditional insistence on UN Security Council sanction for military intervention in sovereign states, as I say, reinforced by the lessons of Kosovo, Iraq and Libya. And this has become a core tenet of Russian foreign policy. It's Russia's response to the clash between the principles of, on the one hand, respect for state sovereignty, territorial integrity and non-intervention in the affairs of sovereign states, usually called the Westphalian system for shorthand. The IR people will know what I'm talking about. And on the other hand, the emerging norm of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect vulnerable populations. And this was only too visible in Syria, where Moscow's key demand was clear, as I referred to before: no regime change, despite the humanitarian atrocities there, no regime change in the case of complex internal conflicts. Having said that, you could well turn around to me and said that Russia's de facto annexation of Crimea seems to make Moscow's respect for international law seem purely cynical. You've read in the newspapers probably in the last couple of weeks, the territory became part of the Soviet Union in 1954. It remained Ukrainian after the collapse of the USSR in 1991, when even John and I were young and beautiful in those days. Is that right?
I wasn't.
You were. Russia unambiguously recognised Ukraine and its pre-annexation borders in the Alma-Ata Declaration of 1991, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which offered security guarantees to Ukraine in exchange for the withdrawal of Ukraine's nuclear arsenal to Russia after the end of the USSR, obviously. And the 1997 Black Sea Fleet Agreement, which says Russia can only redeploy its troops in consultation with the Ukrainian authorities. Annexation seems to break all of these rules. Russia's moved in troops, it said it hasn't, but it has. This contravenes a UN definition from about 40 years ago of aggression. It sponsored pro-Russian elements in Crimea to displace the lawful public authorities and can't claim an armed attack against them, which would then trigger the UN Charter rights to self-defence. Nor can it claim the doctrine of humanitarian intervention because, unlike in the case of Kosovo, there hasn't been any real kind of existential threat to the survival of the population. In any case, this wouldn't allow Russia, this wouldn't entitle Russia to cause a change in the status of the territory. Moscow's claim is that the interim government displaced Yanukovych illegally. But this clashes with the fact that Yanukovych was completely disowned by the Ukrainian parliament. And in any case, Putin said in his speech last week that Yanukovych is finished. You know, very contradictory speech. We'll talk about that maybe later on. Its claim, Moscow's claim, that the interim government is therefore illegal and composed of extremists and terrorists really conflicts with the reality. I mean, there are some, you know, moderately unsavoury characters. 1 minute? Yeah. Okay, okay. The real reason, it seems to me, is that Moscow perceives the West as meddling in the Ukraine to the detriment of Russia's interest. Finally, Crimea may be entitled to secede, but according to international precedent, it needs to negotiate with the central authorities, as in the case with Kosovo, when in the period prior to its independence it was administered by the UN. It can't just proceed with secession and incorporation into the Russian Federation as a result of armed support and be consistent with accepted interpretations of international law. So in the final 30 seconds, I try to look objectively at Russian foreign policy. And the norms of international law are contested. But this action over Crimea, despite Moscow's claims to be within its international legal rights, seems mainly to rest on the principle of might makes right. A debate is now emerging over whether this represents purely a reaction to events in Ukraine, or whether it's a revisionist strategy. In other words, revising the rules, borders, etc., which were laid down in the immediate post-Cold War period. And Western leaders and the NATO Secretary-General Rasmussen has said this. My feeling, and this is just based on empirical evidence of post-Russian Soviet post-Soviet Russian foreign policy today, is that it's mainly reactive. I may be wrong. Russia still recognises the need to play a more influential global role, and there is an acute awareness of the complex dependencies and constraints it faces, which it seems to me, I may be wrong as I just said, will eventually lead to a return to some kind of partnership with the leading Western countries. But in either case, whether it's revisionist or whether it's simply going to kind of, you know, go back into the pre-Crimea way of dealing with the West, the situation is still fraught with unpredictable consequences. That's it.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to all our speakers. Okay, we do have some time for questions, so I'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time. It's quite nice for a panel to know who's asking the questions. If you just say your name and which department you're from, if you're a undergrad, postgrad research student or staff, would be great. So the floor is open for questions. Who wants to kick off? Great. Hi.
Hi, my name is Adam and I'm studying politics, and you spoke quite a lot about different identities within Ukraine, basically different cultures clashing each other right now. But looking to the future, could you actually imagine Ukraine breaking further apart, so not just losing Crimea, but more eastern regions, and would you actually think it's actually beneficial to the Ukrainian people?
Thanks. Is that to anyone in particular or the whole panel?
In general.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks very much. I'll take another couple of questions and then I've got time to think about it. Hi.
Hi, I'm Otis and I study archaeology. I was just wondering what the whole panel thought of the legitimacy of the Crimean referendum and whether the ideas of self-determinationism should be placed higher than the practicalities and conventions of international law.
Okay, thanks very much. Take another question before the panel. Hi.
Hi, my name is Matt. I'm from the undergrad and politics department. I was wondering how inevitable was the clash between the West and Russia in the sense we've seen.
Again for the whole panel?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Shall we go in the same order? Who's writing that question? Victoria, anything to say?
Well, as regards whether Ukraine could split up, I mean, it's hard to gauge through the crystal ball for sure. I mean, I would say personally, my opinion is probably not. I mean, there are certainly people in Donetsk fearing invasion from Russia, which would imply that. But I think the elites in the Donbass would prefer, as Adam said, a more federalist arrangement. People conceptualize themselves as Ukrainians. I think they would prefer to be powerful elites within a smaller state rather than smaller elites within a larger state, notwithstanding the fact that, you know, Renat Akhmetov of Donetsk, one of the main backers of former President Yanukovych, is an exceptionally rich man, even by Western standards, I guess. But I would say that even from the Russian perspective, I think, to cause further disintegration of the Ukrainian state wouldn't necessarily be in Russia's interest. It would indeed provoke a lot more antagonistic relations with the West, cause a lot more problems for Russia. And as far as I understand it, and indeed as Putin said in his speech of the 18th of March, this isn't in Russia's interest. It's not what they foresee. It's not necessary for Russia to reintegrate Ukraine territorially, spatially, politically. But on the other hand, however, there is an imperative to reintegrate Ukraine culturally, spiritually, ideologically, to secure it as an ally of Russia, as a country that they can work closely with, where they have channels of influence, because Ukraine is indeed an important ally. It's sometimes cited as the most important ally of Russia, not just for objective economic, strategic reasons, though these do indeed exist, but also for important cultural regions, issues of Russian national identity, given that Russia traces the origins of its statehood back to Kiev. It's known as the mother of Russian cities. So to lose Ukraine to the West, as it is sometimes conceptualized, would be a blow to Russian claims to be a civilization, to be a great power. Shall I?
Okay, thank you for the questions. First question: Will the east of Ukraine split? I mean, I said in my opening remarks that in Donetsk Oblast, I think 33%. Okay, we had this comment about 61% want to join Britain, and that's because Donetsk was founded by Welshmen. Actually.
Yes,
John Hughes. That's why you had this interesting poll that was published over the last few days. But an earlier poll suggested 33% wanted to join unity with Russia. Having said that, I was in Donetsk a couple of weeks ago, and my impression is that the real separatists are a small minority, and they are also old. They are pensioners, and they are poor, and they are unemployed. Whereas the pro-unity, the pro-peace campaigners in Donetsk are young, are educated, and middle class. And so this generational divide, which Victoria mentioned, I think is really important. And whereas I think there was a possibility 2-3 weeks ago that Russia might have invaded, that an internal kind of fracturing or an internal movement might have emerged in the Donbass and other eastern oblasts, I think that time has probably passed now. I think it's unlikely that we'll see a kind of rapid move to separatism in East Ukraine. However, I think there's a longer term story, which is what happens to the economy. The economy, as I said, is going to do very badly this year. If the IMF comes in, then the IMF package is going to disappoint not only the revolutionaries in Kiev, but also the average hard-working person in East Ukraine. And in those conditions, when you have wage arrears, when you have welfare cuts, pension cuts, when the price of gas goes up, when the price of electricity goes up, then there's a real possibility that you'll get a social crisis. And it's quite possible that people might look to Crimea and even see that as a kind of positive scenario. I think Russia has already announced that it's going to raise salaries in Crimea and raise public service salaries and pensions to the Russian rate, which are higher than in Ukraine. So I think precisely what will happen in East Ukraine will really depend upon what happens to the economy. Another factor in East Ukraine is also going to be the oligarchs. The hated oligarchs are ironically one of the most important integrative factors in Ukraine from now on. Mr. Akhmetov has his assets, his holdings all the way around Ukraine. And he, if no one else, has an incentive for the country to remain united, so he doesn't lose control of his assets. So the oligarchs are likely to provide an incentive for unity. But then another factor is precisely how does the government, and there's likely to be a new government after the presidential election, how inclusive are they? Do they represent the voices of industry? Do they represent the voices of the east and the south of the country? What is their policy going to be towards decentralization, towards use of the language, towards partnership with Russia? And a very kind of narrow-looking West Ukrainian, Central Ukrainian government could alienate the east of the country in exactly the same way as the Donbass government under Yanukovych in Kiev alienated the west of the country. So in the short term, I do not see the east of Ukraine splitting. However, in the longer term, I think there are a whole series of weaknesses, which is why I think federalism is likely to be the answer to kind of manage these issues. Second question about whether the referendum in Crimea was legitimate. Well, I'm not an IR person or a legal scholar, so I'll leave that to others. But I think it happened. Russia, Ukraine lost control over Crimea, and by hook or by crook, local elites and with Russian influence organised this referendum. I mean, my own view is that in ordinary circumstances, if you didn't have the polarising effect of the ousting of Yanukovych, if you'd had a proper campaign where you'd had both sides of the view put, then it's quite likely that there would have been a small majority in favour of unity with Russia. I mean, in 1991, when the Ukrainian independence referendum took place, it was almost a 50-50 split. You also had a situation whereby the last local elections to the Crimean Parliament, something like 65% of voters voted for pro-Russian parties. There is a genuine popular will in Crimea that supports unity with Russia. Now, whether you think the referendum was legitimate or not, and again, the opinion poll I mentioned about the 33% in Donetsk, it was 41% in Crimea. So it's not something that was kind of foisted upon a discontented population. Third question about who's expansionist, is it east or west? I mean, my view is that the West triggered the Ukraine crisis and that Russia has reacted. So in that sense, I think if anyone has been expansionist, then in this case I would argue it's actually been the West rather than Russia. I think Crimea is a consolation prize. The big prize, if you like, is that the West has got its people in the corridors of power in Kiev where they didn't have it a month ago.
Adam's question on the breaking further apart of the Ukraine. One little linguistic point that hasn't come up at all is this confusion in Russian for the words for Russians. And Putin in many ways is acting almost like the last Russian emperor in his attitude to the Russians. And he was the emperor and autocrat of all the Russias. And then they list it, Moscow, Kiev. So Moscow's first, Kiev is second. And I think the Crimea comes, he's the Tsar of Crimea too. So in many ways the Russians do have this very particular, some would say anachronistic attitude to who are members of their community. People have drawn sort of parallels with the British Empire, and it's almost as if the Australians, the Canadians, the South Africans were still regarded by the British authorities as British, in the same way, of course, that the French still do with Guadeloupe and Martinique and did with Algeria. Sevastopol, again, which hasn't really been highlighted too much, is it's a double red line, if you like. That is the base, the historical base for the Black Sea Fleet. That was, of course, where Tolstoy fought in the Crimean War against us. As we remember the charge of the Light Brigade, they remember the defence, the siege of Sevastopol. And I noticed that Crimea and Sevastopol have both been admitted to the Russian Federation as separate subjects. So, worst case scenario, the Russians will keep on to Sevastopol. Putin actually mentioned that he didn't mind NATO sailors coming as our guests to Sevastopol, but he wasn't going to allow Russians having to go to Sevastopol to be greeted by NATO sailors. Absolutely firm. So even if the Crimea, which is very unlikely, is handed back, Sevastopol will not be. And incidentally, under the 2010 agreement on Sevastopol and Feodosia, the other big naval base, Russians are allowed 25,000 troops in those two areas. So although Derek is correct in saying that many more troops were rushed towards Crimea when this crisis broke, Putin made sure that he kept within that 25,000. And also, of course, he made sure that he kept within the legalities of Russian law over the admission of Crimea and Sevastopol to the Federation. Otis, the referendum was not legitimate in that international law states that for an area to secede, the area that they wish to secede from has to give their consent to that referendum. So that with the Scottish independence referendum, Britain has agreed that Scotland has the right to vote for independence if it likes. Ukraine was not given that opportunity. Secondly, of course, I'm sure you've seen the pictures of the actual campaign itself, very short campaign. It was either a Crimea in red with a Nazi swastika, or a Crimea in the white, blue and red of the Russian flag. It was no choice at all. You know, it wasn't. They didn't have the yellow and blue flag. No, it wasn't. It wasn't a referendum that we could say was legitimate. But I'd agree with Adam. He mentioned at the time of the Ukrainian independence referendum in 1921, where well over 80% of Ukrainians voted for independence from the Soviet Union, it barely got a majority in Crimea. So even then, the Crimeans didn't really want to go along with the rest of Ukraine. And the final question on how inevitable was it? Again, I'd agree with Adam that we did start it off. Anyone interested in conspiracy theories? It does actually coincide with the refusal by the European Union for GM crops. What is Ukraine famous for, apart from being a bride basket? You know, you can't go on a Ukrainian site without seeing, want to marry a Ukrainian down the side. It's a bread basket. Monsanto is very interested in moving out of Europe into Ukraine. Another country that's very interested in moving into Ukraine is China. China is trying to buy agricultural land in the Ukraine the size of Belgium to grow corn and pork. Why? Because of China's burgeoning population. You know, a massive, massive investment along those lines. And against that, and here again I agree with Adam, the IMF. IMF has not had a great record in regime change because, you know, after all, it was the IMF in effect that handled the shock therapy in Russia, in which the transition to democracy, in the words of most Russians that I met at the time, was a transition to not democratia, but dermocratia, which is shitocracy. And, you know, it's the very, very tough, the cutting of pensions, the sacking, the taking away of the safety net is something that would be very popular perhaps with the taxpayers in the West, very popular with multinational companies, incredibly unpopular with the Ukrainian people. And I think the Ukrainian people, what they desperately, desperately need at this stage is some kind of mechanism that they can overcome what is still the biggest negative point about the Ukraine. It's even more corrupt than Russia. In Transparency International's most recent report, it was 144th out of 177 countries in the world. You know, corruption is endemic. Russia is slightly better than that, Belarus is slightly better than that, but that doesn't stop you getting into NATO, because Albania isn't exactly high on that list either, and as you know, there was a nationwide debate in this country when Albania was invited to join NATO. So if corruption, and that's really what the people on Maidan wanted, to get rid of the corrupt regime, and I don't know if you picked up the nurse who was offered the Ministry of Health and refused, because she said the new government was just changing one set of crooks for another set of crooks. What Ukraine desperately needs is 2 decades of relative relative tranquility, neither east nor west, but with both sides in a way creating the stability and order that Derek had said are so eagerly sought, certainly by Russia, and one would hope that instability in that part of the world is not something that we would advocate.
Thank you. Derek?
Yeah, I think quite a bit's been said already, so I'll try and keep it relatively short. On identity, will Ukraine split along ethnic and linguistic lines? As I say, I actually, maybe less so than some of the other panellists, think that the identity thing is maybe a little bit overblown. Certainly from a Russian point of view, as I say, that it seems to me that Russia believes in a kind of broader European civilization. Equally, of course, as was pointed out, the Ukrainians are seen by the Russians as their brothers. And those who are rejecting the links with Russia, in other words, people sometimes say the Western Ukrainians, but I mean, I don't think it's just Western Ukrainians. Those who have kind of sort of formed probably the majority of the Indian government are seen by Moscow as nationalists and extremists. There isn't yet, there is a narrative in Russia at the moment of Eurasianism, in a kind of sense of a separate civilization to Europe. But my feeling is, it's never really taken hold. That the majority of the political class don't really buy it. It's usually Alexander Dugin who is the carrier of this. It has, in some Russian, leading politicians, it does sort of strike a chord. But I don't think it's really got hold of the political class as a whole. What Putin has been talking about over the last 3 years is a Eurasian Union, but that is something entirely different. What he's talking about in the Eurasian Union is something like a European Union, where Russia will join together, we have the customs union at the moment between Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan, with Armenia and probably, I think, Kyrgyzstan probably joining. That will become a Eurasian economic union, and Putin's vision is for a broader Eurasian union. But he hasn't set that completely against, in terms of identity and civilizational terms, if you like, against Europe. He sees this as a kind of, something like the Olympic rings. You would have the European Union and you would have the Eurasian Union as a kind of sort of ring linking Europe with the Asia Pacific. So I just think the identity thing is sometimes a little bit overblown. Second, the legitimacy of the referendum. I think I tried to make clear in the talk. It seems to me that, in terms of accepted international law, it wasn't really legitimate. Moscow has sponsored pro-Russian efforts to close down the public space for the local Crimean minorities. It's displaced the legitimate national authorities, in other words, the national government in Kiev. Having said that, I do, like it was already being said, I do feel sorry for the average man on the street in Ukraine. And the question, which I think has been pretty much raised by a couple of the other panellists, what has the Ukrainian governing class been doing over the last 22, 23 years to cement political and economic sovereignty in Ukraine? And the answer is bugger all, quite honestly. It's a bit of a basket case, as was pointed out. Corruption was already mentioned. I liked there was a part of a newspaper article, there was an interview with a Crimean lady who said, do you know why we like Putin? A Russian, ethnic Russian Crimean. Do you know why we like Putin? She said, because Putin steals. But when Putin steals, he gives 50% back to the population. When Yanukovych stole, he stole the lot. And he kept it all for himself. And I think, there's a grain of truth there somewhere. It is a basket case. In terms of GDP per head of population, Ukraine, along with noticeably the other more kind of, if you like, democratic European-leaning countries, Georgia and Moldova, is among the lowest compared with the GDP per head of population in 1991, something like 60-odd%. So it really is a sort of, as I say, I feel sorry for it. Just on the question, the point that John raised about the parent nation has to give its consent to secession as part of sovereign territory, but of course, what do the Russians say? Kosovo. They talk about Kosovo. Kosovo was said to be by the European Union sui generis, a unique case. But how many unique cases can you have in international law? I mean, okay, Kosovo, as I tried to explain, you did have the very, very grave humanitarian situation. but nevertheless, we, you know, purely in terms of kind of traditional international law. And the third and final point, I don't know whether the question was how inevitable was the clash between the West and Europe, or how inevitable is a further clash between the West and Russia?
It was the former.
The former, okay, there was, okay, how inevitable? Well, I think I've tried to kind of explain how I see over the last 15 years, you know, how that clash has been slowly but surely gathering pace. Probably more interested, you know, to what extent or how inevitable is a further clash between West and Russia, if you don't mind my answering that question. And here, if we're all sort of making jokes, I like the one about 64% of people in Donetsk wanting to join the UK. Another sort of like slightly bit of lateral thinking. I don't know if anybody watched the Andrew Marr show on BBC One on Sunday morning, but they interviewed the Vladimir Chechnya, the Russia's ambassador to the European Union, a very, very experienced diplomat, and John McCain, yeah, who ran on the Republican ticket against Obama the first time. I think, in my view, John McCain should stick to making frozen chips, but that's another question. Chechnya said something very interesting, very funny rather. Andrew Marr was talking about, you know, we've had Crimea, you know, will Eastern Ukraine be next? Will Transnistria, you know, the frozen conflict with Moldova be next? And Chechnya said, you better ask Senator McCain about Alaska.
Yeah.
And Andrew Marr said, Alaska, but surely that's part of the US. And he said, yes, but it used to be part of Russia. And then there was silence for a couple of seconds. Then Chechnya burst out laughing and said, I'm joking, of course. Plus, the point I've got here is, you know, that these things can be kind of self-generating, if you like, you know what I mean? And as I say, the narrative has been, you know, from the Western leaders, I mean, Cameron, Jesus Christ, you know. I mean, you know, for me, Cameron, it seems to me, I'm sure that before he became Prime Minister, Cameron thought foreign affairs was having a bit of rumty-tumty with the French maid whenever he travelled over to Paris or something like that. Because, you know, we haven't got a foreign policy. We really have not got a foreign policy. Anyway, there's a lot of talk about containment and deterrence. Rewinding the clock back to the end of the 1960s, 1970s, after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. So, if we have containment and deterrence, that flies in the face of everything that NATO and the West and even the US has been doing, less so the US, but certainly NATO, over the last 15 or 20 years, trying to take advantage of the peace dividend. National expenditures on defence in most countries have been dropping. In some cases, they've been dropping virtually through the floor. So, if we're going to go back to containment and deterrence, this means serious financial and material costs, which I don't think the West is prepared to bear. In the case of the US, which obviously, you know, has the biggest sort of defence spending in the entire world, the US now is concerned with what's happening in North Africa and the Middle East, and what's happening in the Asia-Pacific region. You know, the so-called Obama pivot to Asia. They don't really want to be dealing with old Cold War things again. On the other hand, if we let Moscow get away with it, under the kind of, you know, kind of Munich 1938 appeasement, then this is seen as allowing Moscow's neo-imperialist expansion. And of course that brings costs with it, but these are reputational costs. What the hell is NATO for? And what the hell is the West going to do? You know, how far can Moscow go? So the West is in a pretty difficult situation. Personally, I think Putin is possibly painting himself into a bit of a corner as well, but that, you know, that's a question maybe we can talk about after the, because I saw a signal there. Is there not a signal that we're almost finished? We are, right, yeah. So, you know, maybe talk about it later, if anybody wants to come and talk about it. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much again. We can thank our panel for... We are out of time. So thank you, Joel. Thank you very much to you all for coming along, and thank you very much to the Exchange for organising it. The panel will be invited to the interval bar downstairs. So if you had any questions that I'm afraid we didn't have time to address, then please do talk to the panel then. And anything that?
Just thank our panel and thank everyone for coming. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks.